My quiet suburban life exploded into chaos when I discovered four massive military cargo containers blocking my driveway. The HOA's punishment for my 2-inch too tall garden gnomes. But what did Eleanor and her power-hungry board do when they realized they'd just declared war on their own state governor? Giant military containers blocked my driveway. I blinked hard, wondering if the exhaustion from my 2-week business trip was making me hallucinate. Nope, they were real. For massive green metal boxes stood arranged in a perfect wall between me and my garage. What in the world? I dropped my suitcase on the sidewalk. A note fluttered on my mailbox, bright yellow and impossible to miss. I snatched it, hands shaking. Notice of violation. Property owner has 30 days to remedy infractions or face additional consequences. Containers will remain until all fines are paid in full. My blood boiled as I spotted Eleanor Watson marching across the street, clipboard in hand, wearing that familiar smug smile. The Queen Bee upon Crest Haven's HOA had been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Reynolds, welcome home. I see you've noticed our enforcement action." She gestured to the containers like she was showcasing art at a gallery. "Eleanor, what is this? You can't just block someone's driveway." "Actually, we can." She flipped through her clipboard. "Section 17.9 of the bylaws, which you signed, gives us authority to take reasonable measures to enforce compliance." Meredith Powell, Eleanor's faithful second-in-command, appeared from behind a container. "The garden gnomes exceed height restrictions by 2 inches. The bird feeder violates our wildlife ordinance." "In your mailbox?" "The wrong shade of black." "Wrong shade of black?" I interrupted. "That's the mailbox I've had for 7 years." Eleanor clicked her tongue. "We updated the acceptable color palette during your absence. All residents were notified via email." I pulled out my phone, checking my inbox while trying to keep my cool. I've been in areas with no service for most of my trip. This is completely unreasonable. "Rules are rules, Mr. Reynolds." Eleanor's voice dripped with fake sympathy. "The total fine comes to $24,800. Meredith announced cheerfully. "Daily compounding penalties, plus the administrative fee for container placement." My neighbor, Thomas, jogged over. "Don, what's going on?" "Holy cow, those are big containers." Eleanor shot him a warning look. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Miller. Those things are blocking the sidewalk too," Thomas pointed out. "That can't be legal. They're on HOA common property." Eleanor snapped. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have other violations to address." As they walked away, Thomas whispered, "They've gone completely power crazy. While you were gone, they fined Mrs. Dawson $500 because her granddaughter visited without a visitor's pass." I took deep breaths, tried to process this madness. Where would I even get military containers? Eleanor's brother works for government surplus. Suddenly, these things started appearing whenever someone really makes her mad. Thomas checked to make sure they were out of earshot. Yesterday, I saw them measuring my grass with a ruler. My phone buzzed a reminder. The governor's office was expecting me at 9 a.m. tomorrow for my first day. After years working as a special investigator for the state, I'd been appointed to lead a new task force on housing reform. The irony wasn't lost on me. I need to get these containers moved tonight. I walked around the massive metal boxes, each at least 20 feet long. "Good luck with that," Thomas sighed. The Rodriguez family had one blocking their driveway for 3 weeks because their Christmas lights stayed up 2 days past January 7th. I snapped photos of the containers, the yellow notice, and my supposedly offensive garden gnomes. Then I spotted something interesting on one container, a military identification number, barely visible under a hasty coat of paint. "Thomas, can you give me a ride to a hotel? I need to make some calls." That night, I couldn't sleep, not just because of the uncomfortable hotel bed, but because pieces were clicking together in my mind. For 6 months, I've been investigating HOA abuses across the state. Complaints about excessive fines, selective enforcement, and financial mismanagement. Pine Crest Haven had come up repeatedly in my research. I'd planned to settle in before revealing my new position to the neighborhood. But Eleanor had forced my hand. My phone rang at 6 a.m. "Governor Reynolds? This is General Patterson from Fort Madison. We've located those missing cargo containers." "You were right. They were never properly decommissioned." Someone's going to be in serious trouble. I smiled. Thank you, General. I like to be there when you recover that. 3 hours later, I stood across the street as military police arrived at my house. Eleanor and Meredith rushed over, faces flushed with panic. What's happening? Eleanor demanded as soldiers examined the containers. A stern-faced colonel approached her. Ma'am, these containers are property of the United States military. Serial numbers indicate they were reported missing from Fort Madison 3 months ago. May I ask how they came to be here? Eleanor's face went pale. My brother said they were properly surplused. Your brother's name, ma'am? As Eleanor stammered through an explanation, I stepped forward. Colonel, I'm Don Reynolds. These containers are blocking my property. The colonel nodded. Yes, sir. We'll have them removed immediately. Eleanor's eyes widened with recognition. Reynolds? Wait, are you related to the new governor? I smiled. Not related. I'm the governor, and I'd like to know why my HOA is using stolen military equipment to harass homeowners. Meredith gasped. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the military vehicle. This is all a misunderstanding. Eleanor insisted, her voice high and tight. We followed proper procedures for rule enforcement. We'll discuss procedures at tonight's HOA meeting, I replied calmly. I believe it's open to all residents. I'll be there. As the containers were loaded onto military transporters, Thomas appeared beside me, grinning from ear to ear. Governor Reynolds, huh? Eleanor looks like she might pass out. The state has received over 200 complaints about this HOA in the past year. I told him. I think it's time for some changes in Pine Crest Haven. Little did I know, Eleanor wasn't one to surrender power easily, and she was already planning her counterattack. Whispers filled the community center as I slipped into the back row of the HOA meeting. At first, nobody noticed me. All eyes were on Eleanor at the podium, struggling to maintain her composure after the day's events. Before we address the agenda items, she announced, her voice steady despite her white-knuckle grip on the podium, I'd like to acknowledge the misunderstanding regarding enforcement actions at the Reynolds property. It appears there was a clerical error. Meredith nodded vigorously from her seat. Absolutely, an administrative oversight. Stealing military property is more than an oversight, called out Mrs. Dawson, an elderly woman in the front row. It's a crime. Nobody stole anything. Eleanor snapped. Now, moving to tonight's agenda, what about the fines? Thomas interrupted. Is Don still expected to pay $24,800 for having garden gnomes? The room erupted in chatter. I watched carefully as Eleanor exchanged glances with the other board members. 5 people who controlled every aspect of her through fear and intimidation. Order. I will have order. Eleanor banged her gavel. The board will review the Reynolds violations in private session. Why private? Someone called out. Let's discuss it now. Eleanor's face reddened. Because that's procedure. Now, regarding the Anderson property on Maple Lane, the board has denied their request for fence variances. The Thompsons on Pine Circle are being fined for unauthorized wind chimes. The Rodriguez family wind chimes? Mrs. Dawson stood up shakily. Maria Thompson hung those wind chimes after her husband died. They were his favorite. Eleanor ignored her. The Rodriguez family continues to violate Section 14.2 by parking their work van in their driveway. Daily fines will continue. I listened as Eleanor rattled off a dozen more violations, each more petty than the last. The room grew increasingly tense, residents exchanging looks of frustration and resignation. When public comments finally opened, I approached the microphone. My name is Don Reynolds. I began. The room immediately quieted. I'd like to ask the board a few questions about governance and financial transparency. Eleanor's smile looked painfully forced. Mr. Reynolds, we're aware of your position. We welcome your input as a resident, though board matters are handled according to our established procedures. I understand. My first question, when was the last external audit of HOA finances? Meredith jumped in. We conduct internal reviews quarterly. That's not what I asked. When was the last independent audit? The board members glanced at each other nervously. We haven't found that necessary, Eleanor replied coldly. Interesting. My second question, Where did you get the authority to use military equipment for enforcement action? As I stated earlier, that was an unfortunate error that's been corrected. An error that somehow happened 4 times? Those containers were reported missing 3 months ago. Around the same time, containers started appearing in our neighborhood. A man in a polo shirt stood up. They put one of those things in front of my house because my son's basketball hoop was 6 inches too tall. More residents began calling out their experiences. Containers for unapproved plant species. Containers for holiday decorations left up too long. Containers for bird baths and lawn ornaments. Eleanor banged her gavel repeatedly. This is not on the agenda. Order. I continued calmly. My final question. Are you aware that I've spent the last 6 months leading a state investigation into HOA abuses, and that Pinecrest Haven has the highest complaint rate in the entire state? The room went completely silent. One board member looked concerned. What kind of investigation? I pulled out my state ID and a folder of documents. My team has collected statements from over 50 residents in this community, describing systematic harassment, selective enforcement, and possible financial misconduct. Eleanor's face hardened. This is inappropriate intimidation. You're using your political position for personal vengeance. Actually, I replied, placing documents on the table. I became interested in HOA reform law before moving here. But your actions have provided an excellent case study in why reform is needed. Thomas stepped forward. I have security camera footage of Eleanor and Meredith measuring my grass at 5 a.m. and then coming back with spray paint to mark violations. Is that normal procedure? More residents stood, suddenly eager to share their stories. Mrs. Dawson described being forced to repaint her front door 4 times because the shade of blue was insufficient. The Rodriguez family had been fined because their son's wheelchair ramp didn't match the approved aesthetic. Eleanor suddenly grabbed her things. This meeting is adjourned. The board will reconvene in private to address these concerns. Actually, I said, state law requires HOA meetings to remain open when financial matters are discussed. And I have some very interesting financial questions. I nodded to a woman who had just entered the room. This is Special Investigator Patel from the State Attorney's Office. She has some questions about large cash withdrawals from the HOA account over the past. Eleanor froze. Her eyes darted to Meredith in panic. Meredith suddenly bolted for the door, but was stopped by a state trooper who had entered quietly during the commotion. We have a warrant to examine HOA financial records, Investigator Patel announced, and to search the homes of board members for evidence related to our investigation. This is outrageous, Eleanor shouted. Actually, the investigator replied coolly. The judge was particularly interested in the connection between missing military property and HOA enforcement actions. State officers led Eleanor and Meredith outside. The remaining board members huddled together in shock. Residents began talking excited, some approaching me with more stories of abuse. Thomas clapped me on the shoulder. You knew this would happen today, didn't you? That's why you didn't fight harder about the containers this morning. I nodded. Sometimes, you need to let people show exactly who they are. Outside, Eleanor was being questioned beside a police car. She spotted me watching, and her eyes narrowed with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've started, she called out. No idea at all. I didn't know then just how far she would go for revenge. By morning, I would discover that crossing Eleanor Watson came with consequences far worse than garden gnome violation. Glass shattered in my bedroom as flames suddenly lit up the darkness. I bolted upright, choking on smoke that poured through my broken window. Fire alarms shrieked as orange light flickered across my walls. What the? I stumbled from bed, grabbing my phone and ducking low. The clock read 3:17 a.m. The hallway was already filling with thick smoke. My living room glowed an angry red. Something had crashed through my front window and set my couch ablaze. The fire spread with unnatural speed, climbing quickly up my curtains. I dialed 911, coughing violently as I rushed to the back door. Fire, 1478 Maple Drive. Someone threw something. I couldn't finish before another explosion rocked the house. My kitchen window blew inward, and more flames erupted outside in my back. The cool night Air hit my lungs with sweet relief. I ran around to the front of my burning home, joining neighbors who had emerged in their pajamas. Don, are you okay? Thomas appeared, grabbing my arm. I called the fire department already. Fire trucks wailed in the distance, but my attention caught on a car speeding away, headlights off, moving fast. Did you see that? I pointed, but the vehicle had already vanished around a corner. No, but I saw something else. Thomas pulled me aside as more neighbors gathered. Eleanor and Meredith were standing across the street just before your house went up. They disappeared when the first window broke. Firefighters arrived, rushing to connect hoses and tackle the blaze. I stood watching my home burn, still processing what Thomas had said. Detective Wilkins arrived 20 minutes later, notebook in hand. Governor Reynolds, I understand you believe this was arson. I know it was, I replied, my voice hollow even to myself. Multiple points of origin, simultaneous explosions. And my neighbor saw Eleanor Watson and Meredith Powell watching just before it started. The detective frowned. The same women who were just released on bail 4 hours ago for financial fraud and misappropriation? The very same. The fire chief approached, his face grim. We found fragments of 3 Molotov cocktails. Definitely arson. You're lucky to be alive, Governor. As dawn broke, I stood in front of the charred shell of my home, water from the firefighters' hoses pooling in my driveway, reflecting the rising sun. Nearly everything I owned was gone. You can stay with us, Thomas offered, his wife nodding beside him. As long as you need. Thanks, but I need to make some calls. I dialed Investigator Patel's number. She answered immediately. I heard what happened. We're already on it. Officers are looking for Watson and Powell now. They won't be hard to find, I replied, watching a news van pull up. They think they've won. By noon, my story was everywhere. Governor targeted. Arson attack after HOA investigation. Reporters swarmed Pine Crest Haven, interviewing residents about Eleanor's reign of terror. Mrs. Dawson appeared on the local news, her voice shaking with anger. That woman made me repaint my door 4 times. And now she tries to burn down the governor's house? She belongs in prison. The Rodriguez family showed reporters the wheelchair ramp they'd been fined over. Our son couldn't even get into our home without it, but they called it an unapproved structure. From Thomas's guest bedroom, I watched the coverage while drafting emergency HOA reform legislation. My phone rang constantly, colleagues, investigators, residents offering support. At 4 p.m., Investigator Patel called. We found them at Eleanor's sister's cabin. They're in custody. What evidence do you have? Beside my neighbor's testimony, gas cans in their trunk, glass bottles matching the fragments from your house. And she paused. A list of other residents they planned to target. The Rodriguez family was next. I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. Are they talking? Eleanor's demanding a lawyer. But Meredith broke down immediately. She says Eleanor convinced her you were planning to destroy their lives, take their homes. Called it self-defense. After hanging up, I stepped outside to find a crowd gathered in Thomas's front yard. At least 30 neighbors, many holding casseroles, tools, and supplies. Mrs. Dawson stepped forward. We heard her staying here. We wanted to help. A woman I barely knew added, my husband's a contractor. He says we can rebuild your place better than before. Another resident chimed in, my son's a lawyer. He wants to help with the HOA reform laws, pro bono. Thomas appeared beside me, grinning. I told you, once people weren't afraid anymore, they'd stand together. That evening, we gathered in the community center, the same room where Eleanor had ruled with her gavel just days. But now, residents filled every seat, speaking freely, sharing experiences, and planning the future of our neighborhood. I stood at the front, not as governor, but as a neighbor who'd lost his home. What happened to me was extreme, but the abuse many of you endured went on for years. Together, we can make sure it never happens. A reporter raised her hand. Governor, will you be moving away after this traumatic experience? The room went quiet, all eyes on me. Absolutely not, I replied firmly. I came here to help create housing reform. Now I've experienced firsthand why it's so desperately needed. As the meeting concluded, Thomas pulled me aside. Arraignment for Eleanor and Meredith is tomorrow. The prosecutor's pushing for maximum charges. Arson, attempted murder of a public official, Conspiracy. I nodded solemnly. I'll be there. This isn't just about me anymore. What I didn't know was that Eleanor had one final move to play. One that would shake not just our neighborhood, but the entire state's understanding of how power corrupts. Cameras clicked rapidly as Eleanor and Meredith entered the courtroom in handcuffs. Eleanor's face remained stone cold. Meredith looked terrified, her eyes red from crying. I sat in the front row beside Thomas and Mrs. Dawson, watching as the judge read the charges. First-degree arson, attempted murder of a public official, conspiracy, theft of military property, embezzlement, and a dozen other counts. How do the defendants plead? Asked Judge Montgomery. Eleanor's attorney stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. Meredith's attorney hesitated, then said, My client wishes to change her plea arrangement, Your Honor. She's prepared to provide testimony against Ms. Watson in exchange for leniency. Eleanor's head snapped toward Meredith, her eyes burning with hatred. You traitor, order! The judge banged her gavel. Ms. Watson, control yourself or I'll have you removed. As the hearing proceeded, I noticed a familiar face entering at the back of the courtroom. State Senator James Fletcher, chairman of the Housing Committee. The man who'd fought against my HOA reform efforts from day one. What was he doing here? The prosecutor approached the bench. Your Honor, Ms. Powell has provided information suggesting this case extends beyond Pine Crest Haven. We're requesting a postponement to investigate new evidence of a statewide corruption network involving multiple HOAs. The judge granted the request, and as the defendants were led away, Senator Fletcher slipped out quickly. I followed him into the hallway. Senator, I'm surprised to see you here. This isn't your district. Fletcher froze, then turned with a practiced smile. Governor Reynolds, just keeping informed on important cases. Interesting, especially since Ms. Powell mentioned a statewide network. Know anything about that? His smile faltered. I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment. As he hurried away, Investigator Patel appeared beside me. We should talk. Privately. In a small conference room, Patel spread out documents on the table. Meredith Powell kept meticulous records. Eleanor didn't know, but Meredith recorded everything. Meetings, phone calls, transactions. She was building her own insurance policy. I scanned the papers, my stomach tightening. These are payments from 12 different HOAs across the state, all funneling into an account controlled by Eleanor and 3 other HOA presidents. Patel pulled out more documents, but doesn't stop there. That money was then distributed to these shell companies. She pointed to a name that made my blood run cold. Clearview Development Partner. That's Senator Fletcher's company, I whispered. Exactly. We believe certain legislators have been using HOAs to squeeze homeowners through excessive fines and fees. The HOA presidents get a cut, and the rest finances political campaigns off the books. It's a massive corruption network. I stared at the evidence, mind racing. This explains why my HOA reform bills kept dying in committee. Fletcher's blocked every attempt at HOA regulation for the past 5 years. Patel tapped a folder. We found drafts of legislation in Eleanor's home, written by Fletcher's office, specifically designed to increase HOA powers and limit homeowner rights. How many lawmakers are involved? We're not sure yet, but we think at least 7 state legislators across both parties. She lowered her voice. This isn't just about petty neighborhood tyrants anymore. This is organized corruption. For the next 2 weeks, I worked closely with state investigators. My temporary home in Thomas's guest room became command central as we connected the dots between corrupt HOA boards and political figures. More homeowners came forward with horror stories. Elderly residents forced to sell because they couldn't pay mounting fines. Families harassed until they moved. Property values deliberately tanked so developer friends could buy cheap. One evening, at my kitchen table, Thomas pointed to a map we'd created showing affected HOAs. There's a pattern here. These neighborhoods are all in districts where development companies want to build, but can't because of existing homes. Mrs. Dawson leaned forward. That's what happened in the east part of Pine Crest. 6 families sold to the same company after Eleanor hit them with thousands in fines. My phone buzzed with a text from Investigator Patel. Grand jury convening tomorrow. Evidence overwhelming. Be ready. The next morning, I watched from my office as the news broke. Breaking. State officials implicated in HOA corruption. Cameras showed Senator Fletcher and 4 other legislators being led from the Capitol in hand. Eleanor and Meredith's case had blown open something much bigger than garden gnomes and military containers. By afternoon, my phone was ringing nonstop with calls from outraged residents across the state. Governor's office, my assistant answered. Yes, he's aware of the situation. Yes, the governor is personally committed to HOA reform. A town hall meeting? I'll add you to the list. I stepped out of a budget meeting to find Thomas waiting, holding a newspaper. Have you seen this? They're calling it Containergate. The front page showed Eleanor Watson glaring at cameras outside the courthouse. The headline read, HOA president charged with arson, corruption, attempted murder of governor. This is bigger than I expected, I admitted. Thomas smiled. People have felt powerless against these boards for years. You're giving them hope. 3 days later, I addressed a packed auditorium of homeowners from across the state. Camera crews lined the back wall. For too long, homeowners associations have operated with minimal oversight, maximum power, and zero accountability. I began. What started with reasonable goals, protecting property values and maintaining neighborhoods, has in too many cases become a weapon for harassment, extortion, and corruption. I outlined my new emergency legislation, mandated financial transparency for all HOAs, caps on fines, prohibition of punitive enforcement tactics, required independent board elections, a new state office to investigate homeowner complaints, no more military containers block driveways, I said to applause, no more $25,000 fines for garden gnomes. A reporter cornered me afterward. Governor, critics say you're using your personal experience to push a political agenda. How do you respond? I'd say they're right. I answered honestly. My experience opened my eyes to abuses happening statewide. Sometimes, it takes a personal connection to understand a systemic problem. 6 months later, I returned to my neighborhood for a special occasion, moving back into my rebuilt home. The construction crew had worked miracles, creating something even better than before. The entire neighborhood turned out for the small celebration. Mrs. Dawson brought homemade cookies. The Rodriguez family's son cut the ribbon from his wheelchair. Thomas and his wife presented me with a housewarming gift, a garden gnome, exactly 2 inches taller than the old HOA regulations had allowed. For your front yard, Thomas grinned. A reminder of how this all started. I placed it prominently by my new front door, next to a freshly installed bird feeder. As neighbors mingled in my new living room, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. Down the street, I could see the for sale sign outside Eleanor's empty house. The community center had a new sign, Pine Crest Haven Homeowners Association, serving our community, not ruling it. My phone buzzed, a text from Investigator Patel, Fletcher pleading guilty, rolling on others, reform bill passing unanimously tomorrow. I smiled, looking up at my rebuilt home. Sometimes, the worst experiences lead to the most important changes. Sometimes, it takes 4 military containers blocking your driveway to start a revolution. And sometimes, it takes a garden gnome 2 inches too tall to remind us that rules without reason, power without compassion, and enforcement without fairness are just another form of tyranny. Thomas joined me on the porch. Penny for your thoughts, Governor? Just thinking about how strange life is, I replied. 6 months ago, I came home to find military containers blocking my driveway. Today, we've exposed corruption, changed state law, and rebuilt a community, all because Eleanor Watson didn't know she was messing with the government. Thomas laughed. No, I corrected him. All because she didn't know she was messing with neighbors who would finally stand together. Inside my new home, surrounded by the people who had become more than just neighbors, I realized we built something far more important than housing. We built a true community, one where power flowed from mutual respect, not fear. One garden gnome at a time.
Hope you enjoyed this story. If you'd like to hear more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.